American audience, perfect for a 10-minute YouTube narration. The language is smooth, atmospheric, and easy to follow while keeping the mystery and horror intact.
Intro music, eerie piano with a soft wind.
In the fall of 1965, something strange happened in the quiet village of Ashworth, hidden deep in the hills of Yorkshire, England. The Higgins family, Thomas, Eleanor, and their 2 children, vanished without a trace from their small cottage. No signs of struggle, no note, no bodies, just gone. For months, local police searched every path, every stream, and every forest trail, but the family seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The case was eventually closed with no answers, just another strange, unsolved mystery. But 3 months later, everything changed. Investigators found a hidden room underneath the ancient village church, St. Mary's. Inside that underground chamber were the Higgins family's personal belongings: coats, jewellery, toys, and something else, journals. Dozens of pages written in Eleanor Higgins's handwriting. Pages filled with details of strange rituals the Church of England had officially banned centuries ago. But the most disturbing part? The final journal entry was dated 2 weeks after the family had already been reported missing. For almost 60 years, the church has refused to comment on what was found. And to this day, the Higgins cottage stands empty, the windows boarded, the garden overgrown. Locals say you can still hear children's laughter coming from the house at night. But what makes this case truly terrifying is what happened 20 years later, in 1985, when sealed church records were finally opened to investigators. What they discovered? The Higgins family wasn't the first to vanish. Other families, centuries ago, had disappeared in nearly the same way, and every one of them had some connection to that same church. Tonight, I'm going to tell you what really happened in Ashworth. I've uncovered documents never seen by the public before, and I've interviewed the only known witness still alive, who has finally decided to break 40 years of silence. But before we dive in, this channel isn't for everyone. It's only for those brave enough to face the darkest stories, the ones authorities tried to erase. If you're one of those rare mystery seekers, subscribe now and let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. Now, let's go back to 1965, to the last autumn the Higgins family ever saw. Ashworth wasn't the kind of place where things changed. Nestled deep in the Yorkshire Dales, this tiny English village had less than 300 people. Most of them had lived there for generations. Their family homes, stone cottages built hundreds of years ago, stood in rows like frozen time. At the heart of the village stood St. Mary's Church, a towering ancient structure built in the year 1187. It sat on ground believed to be sacred even before Christianity reached this part of England. Locals said strange things had always happened there, though nobody really talked about them. That fall, the air in Ashworth felt different. An early cold snap swept through the valley. Leaves turned blood red and golden orange earlier than anyone could remember. Every evening, a thick fog would settle over the village like a ghost, swallowing paths and muffling sound. The fog always seemed heaviest around the church. Some villagers claimed the paths near the graveyard started to shift, like they were walking in circles even though they knew the way. Others said they heard bells at strange hours. One woman, Mrs. Agnes Pemberton, who had lived beside the church her whole life, said she heard the bells ringing underground as if from a deep crypt no one knew existed. Thomas Arthur Higgins was a quiet man. A father of 2, he worked at the post office, just like his father before him. He lived a life of routine, walked his kids to school, sorted the village mail, helped out at St. Mary's on Sundays as a church warden. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to get caught up in anything strange. But his wife, Eleanor, she was different. She had come to Ashworth as a young bride, and even after 15 years, she still stood out. Beautiful, intelligent, and curious. She loved local history, especially old village stories and legends. Eleanor spent her time in the church library reading ancient texts, and her garden was filled with herbs and wildflowers people hadn't seen used in years. Some of the older villagers said her garden reminded them of the old healing women from centuries past. When asked, Eleanor would just smile and say she liked keeping the old ways alive. Their daughter, Margaret Rose, was 12. smart, serious, and thoughtful. She was often seen in the churchyard, writing in her notebook, copying names and dates from old tombstones. Teachers said she acted older than her age, as if she knew more than she should. Her younger brother, Billy, was the complete opposite. Only 8, he was full of energy and always laughing. But that autumn, he started drawing strange pictures, sketches of shadowy figures, twisted gargoyles, and dark staircases leading underground. His teacher asked about the drawings. Billy just said, "It's what the church shows me when the fog comes." Then in early November 1965, the Higgins family disappeared. They were last seen leaving evening service at St. Mary's. It was foggy that night. The bells rang a few minutes late. Thomas had lingered to lock up the church. They never made it home. 3 months later, a maintenance worker discovered a trapdoor beneath the altar in St. Mary's, a door sealed with wax and centuries-old chains. Inside was a room filled with belongings and Eleanor's journals. In them she described visions, chanting from the church walls, her children speaking in ancient tongues. She wrote of a ritual meant to restore the balance between the living and the dead. The last page said, "Tonight we descend. The fog is ready. We will be remembered in the old ways." That page was dated 2 weeks after the family disappeared. To this day, no one knows what really happened to the Higgins family. But one man, a retired priest who was just a junior curate back then, has finally spoken. And what he told me will change everything you think you know about Ashworth Village and St. Mary's Church. In our next episode, I'll reveal what that man saw in the hidden chamber and what he believes still lives beneath the church to this day. Until then, keep your lights on, and remember, not all villages are as peaceful as they seem. Outro music, slowing wind, faint church bells. Subscribe for more true horror and mystery. And tell us, would you walk through the fog in Ashworth? Here is a detailed and engaging version of this section of the story, rewritten in simple English and structured for a 10-minute YouTube narration. It's been adapted for an American audience, keeping the mystery and suspense alive while making the cultural elements easy to follow. Calm, mysterious tone. In most ways, the village of Ashworth looked like something from a postcard. Every Thursday, the townspeople still gathered for market day in the small square beside the old church. These days, the merchants arrived in cars, not horse-drawn carts, but the atmosphere was the same. Familiar faces, quiet routines, and a sense that life here hadn't changed for centuries. The local pub, called the Shepherd's Rest, was where all the real news was shared, over pints of ale and plates of stew. It was the village's unofficial town hall. The post office served not just as a place for mail, but also as a general store, and the school taught children up to age 14 before they moved on to a larger school in the nearby town of Hawes. To outsiders, Ashworth seemed peaceful, simple, safe, but beneath that surface was a much older world, one full of secrets passed down through bloodlines that didn't trust outsiders. You see, Ashworth had always been a closed-off village, not just physically, with its winding roads and mist-covered hills, but socially too. A few old families, the Whitlocks, the Carrs, the Thorntons, had lived there for hundreds of years. They married within their circle, they followed customs no one else really understood, and they kept those customs alive quietly without ever calling attention to them. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian, was one of those people. She was small and sharp-eyed, a woman in her 70s who had never married. Her cottage was filled with dusty books, handwritten manuscripts, and documents the church had tried to destroy during times of religious reform. Some even said she had scrolls written in languages no one could read anymore. She didn't run the village, officially, but everyone knew she was one of the real power holders in Ashworth. Then there was Dr. Edmund Carr. He was the town physician and another member of the old families. After studying medicine in Edinburgh, he came back home to Ashworth with a degree in science and something older. Locals whispered that he still used the healing herbs his grandmother had taught him about. His medical records included something strange, notes on each patient's spiritual health, though he never explained what that meant. Even the village constable, Sergeant Robert Henley, could sense something was off. He had moved to Ashworth 5 years earlier and quickly realised that there were parts of village life he wasn't allowed to see. Whenever he asked questions, the old families just smiled politely and changed the subject. It bothered him. And then, of course, there was Reverend Harold Whitmore. He had served St. Mary's Church for over 20 years. When he first arrived, he was a fresh-faced young man with strong ideas about reforming the church, but over time he changed. His study became cluttered with ancient artifacts, archaeological fragments, and books on forgotten faiths. His sermons, once easy to follow, became strange and filled with phrases like older truths and forgotten gods. Some villagers stopped attending church altogether. Others, mostly the old families, listened more closely than ever.
Narrator voice deepens slightly.
In the weeks before the Higgins family disappeared, people started to notice subtle changes. Eleanor Higgins, normally a cheerful woman who loved gardening and history, began spending long hours in the churchyard, especially after dark. Her neighbour, Mrs. Agnes Pemberton, spotted her carrying bundles of herbs and flowers out at night, whispering to herself as she walked between the graves. When Mrs. Pemberton finally asked her what she was doing, Eleanor only smiled and said, "I'm tending to old traditions, Mrs. Pemberton. Someone has to keep the proper observances." The phrase proper observances didn't mean anything to Mrs. Pemberton, but it sent a chill down her spine. She stopped drawing her curtains at night, and she stopped asking questions. Others noticed changes too. At the village store, Arthur Finch saw Eleanor buying unusual things, pounds of coarse salt, dozens of white candles, and rare herbs from the village herbalist, Mrs. Weatherby. When asked, Eleanor said it was for the harvest festival, but the Higgins family had never celebrated that holiday before, and certainly not like this. At the schoolhouse, the children were changing. Margaret, usually a straight-A student, became distracted and distant. She stared out the window towards St. Mary's Church and scribbled strange symbols in her notebooks. Her writing shifted from facts and essays to stories of ancient wisdom and forgotten truths. Little Billy, just 8 years old, stopped playing with his friends and started drawing. Not normal pictures. These were scenes of robed figures around a stone altar, surrounded by strange symbols. When his teacher asked him what the drawings were, he simply said, "It's what Mummy and Mr. Whitmore taught me about the old church." Even Thomas Higgins, the reliable, quiet postman, seemed worried. When Miss Collins, the teacher, called a parent meeting, he admitted that Eleanor had joined a local history group. He said it was just research, but his hands were shaking and he wouldn't meet her eyes.
That
History group, Thomas mentioned? It was called the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society. Reverend Whitmore started it in 1962. On paper, it looked harmless, a small group of locals who studied Yorkshire folklore and the region's pagan past. Its members included Whitmore, Mrs. Thornton the librarian, Dr. Carr, Mrs. Weatherby the herbalist, and a retired teacher from London named James Crawford. They claimed they were gathering stories and legends to publish a book. Their meetings were held in the church vestry once a month. But by 1963, something had changed. The group stopped just studying history. They started performing it. They began what they called practical demonstrations of old rituals, first small ones like reenactments for study purposes. But over time, those reenactments became more intense, more private. Eleanor Higgins joined the group in early 1964. Her passion for local traditions and herbal remedies made her a valuable member. She contributed notes about seasonal celebrations and herbal rites passed down through generations. But this was no longer just a history club. Behind closed doors, they were practicing ancient rituals, ceremonies meant to restore the balance between the old gods and the new. And the final ritual was something far more serious. Closing tone, low and unsettling. What began as research had become something else. And in October of 1965, Eleanor, Thomas, Margaret, and little Billy Higgins would vanish without a trace, leaving only a journal behind and a hidden chamber beneath the church that no one knew existed. What was this group really doing, and how deep did their influence go? In the next episode, we'll uncover the secrets of the ritual itself and reveal the truth behind the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society. Until then, remember, some traditions were buried for a reason, and some doors should never be opened. Outro music, a low hum, faint whispers, distant church bells. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. An immersive and simplified version of the next 10-minute segment of the Ashworth story, suitable for a horror mystery YouTube channel targeted at an American audience. The language is clean and clear, with vivid atmospheric storytelling designed to hold listener attention and build suspense. Calm but building tension. By the end of 1964, the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society no longer looked like an academic study group. What had started as discussions about farming traditions and herbal medicine had turned into something far more serious and far stranger. At first, their demonstrations seemed innocent enough. Seasonal festivals tied to ancient harvests, meditations based on Celtic lore, and lessons in old plant remedies. But under the growing influence of Reverend Whitmore, the group began to change. The Reverend believed that true understanding of the old ways required more than just reading about them. He told the group that knowledge had been stolen from their ancestors by the early church, and that it was their duty to reclaim it. This wasn't just about history anymore. It was about spiritual survival. They began to meet not once a month, but twice. And they added special meetings on dates that Whitmore called key points in the ancient calendar. These weren't public holidays. These were days that no one else celebrated anymore, for good reason. And it was during these secret observances that Reverend Whitmore introduced the group to a hidden space beneath St. Mary's Church. He claimed to have found it during renovation work, a stone stairwell sealed behind a wall in the crypt, leading down to a room carved into the earth, older than the church itself. There were markings on the walls, strange ones. And Whitmore believed the chamber was used in rituals long before Christianity arrived in Yorkshire. That underground room would become the centre of everything. Eleanor Higgins was one of the group's most passionate members. She brought her deep interest in herbs, seasonal traditions, and folklore. The others were impressed with her research, but it was her ideas that really shifted things. She suggested something bold, that the rituals would only work properly if entire families participated. Ancient customs, she argued, weren't meant to be done by individuals. They were designed to involve parents and children alike. And if you didn't include everyone, you risked leaving something unfinished. That idea changed everything. Thomas Higgins, Eleanor's quiet, practical husband, wasn't sure about all this, but he saw how happy it made her, how excited she was to share what she'd learned. She talked about ancient Yorkshire like it was a living thing, a wisdom that had been hiding in plain sight. So when she invited Thomas to attend a meeting, he agreed. At first, it seemed harmless. He sat through a lecture on medieval farming techniques, crop cycles, hand tools, even how families stored food for winter centuries ago. It was informative, even charming, but over time things grew darker. Eleanor became more withdrawn from village life. She stopped talking about the church as a place of faith and began referring to it as a vessel for ancient energies. She stayed up late reading books that Reverend Whitmore had given her, books filled with symbols and chants, and she began waking before dawn to prepare herbs, powders, and candles that had no clear purpose. The children were being pulled in, too. Eleanor started teaching Margaret and Billy how to respect the old powers, how to prepare offerings, when to stay silent, how to recognize sacred signs in the weather and the land. At first, it seemed like harmless old stories, but Thomas began to notice they were whispering to each other in private, sharing inside jokes and references that made no sense. And when he asked Eleanor what they were learning, she just smiled and said, they're beginning to see the world properly, building tension. By September 1965, Thomas was worried enough to meet with Reverend Whitmore in private. He walked into the vicar's study, expecting a calm talk about boundaries and maybe asking Whitmore to ease up on the lessons. But the room didn't feel like a study anymore. It was filled with strange books, symbols drawn on the walls, and artifacts Thomas didn't recognize. Whitmore listened patiently to his concerns and then said something chilling. He told Thomas that the Higgins family had been chosen, that their bloodline, along with a few others in the village, carried ancient responsibilities, and those duties were not optional. Tradition had to be fulfilled. There was something in Whitmore's voice, something calm but final, that left Thomas deeply shaken. He walked out of that room with a sense of dread he couldn't explain.
Growing intensity.
October came and the strange behaviour worsened. Eleanor made more frequent trips to the church. She brought bundles of dried plants, jars of strange powders, and pages of hand-picked text. She stopped cooking dinner some nights. The children stopped playing with friends and began drawing unsettling images, altars, robed figures, symbols no teacher could explain. Thomas became physically ill. He stopped sleeping. He lost weight. He made 3 visits to Dr. Edmund Carr, complaining of constant anxiety and a feeling of impending doom. In their final session, Thomas asked the doctor if it was possible for evil to survive in a place, if old rituals could leave behind real power. Dr. Carr had no answer. Thomas said Eleanor was spending time in areas of the church that no one else had access to, and claimed she was receiving guidance from outside this world. The doctor, believing it was a spiritual crisis, told him to speak again with Reverend Whitmore. He would regret that advice for the rest of his life.
Dark, dramatic.
The final week of October brought everything to a boiling point. Eleanor stopped going to the market, the children stopped speaking to neighbours, the lights in the Higgins cottage flickered late into the night, and Mrs. Pemberton, who lived next door, said she could hear soft chanting through the wall. There was smoke too, thick, bitter smoke that smelled like burning herbs, or maybe something worse. Then came Halloween, October 31st. It was a Sunday. The morning service at St. Mary's felt off from the start. The fog was so thick it covered the church tower. Inside, the Higgins family sat in their usual pew, but something was wrong. Eleanor stared ahead with laser focus, taking notes during the sermon. Thomas looked pale and tense, hands clenched tightly in his lap. The children sat too still. Reverend Whitmore's sermon wasn't like the others. He spoke about covenants, ancient promises that outlived time. He said, "Tonight we complete what was begun. Tonight the path is opened." To most of the congregation, it made no sense, but a few nodded knowingly. After the service, the Higgins family walked home without speaking. Mrs. Pemberton, tending to her garden, waved. They didn't even look at her. That was the last time anyone saw the family alive.
Haunting finally.
That night, at exactly 8 p.m, the lights in the Higgins cottage went out. On a Sunday, that had never happened before. By 10 p.m, the house was completely dark. But just after midnight, Mrs. Pemberton woke to the sound of chanting. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The voices were low, rhythmic, rising and falling like waves. She got out of bed and moved to her window. What she saw outside changed her forever. In the graveyard of St. Mary's Church, she saw figures, maybe a dozen, moving between the stones. Each held a candle or a torch. The flames flickered in the fog, casting huge shadows on the church. The ground itself seemed to shimmer. And though she couldn't hear the words clearly, she felt them. They echoed in her bones. And the door to the underground chamber opened.
Try it.
The Higgins family would never be seen again. In our next episode, we'll enter that chamber, we'll read the final pages of Eleanor's journal, and we'll uncover what really happened on the night of October 31st, 1965. Here's the next 15-minute segment of the Ashworth mystery, written in simple, vivid English for an American audience. It continues the chilling story with immersive narration building toward the discovery beneath St. Mary's Church. It's crafted as a YouTube voiceover script, suitable for horror mystery content.
Low and mysterious.
When the sun rose over Ashworth on the morning of November 1st, 1965, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The fog lingered longer than usual that day, hanging like a veil over the village. It clung to the gravestones, the church tower, and the Higgins cottage, now eerily silent. No smoke came from the chimney, no footsteps echoed on the garden path. The little home that once overflowed with life and routine had gone still. It wasn't until Monday afternoon that someone knocked on the Higgins door. It was Mr. Arthur Finch from the general store. Thomas hadn't picked up the week's mail as usual. That was unlike him. Arthur knocked again. No answer. He peered through the window. Everything inside looked untouched. Neat, clean, but lifeless. Later that evening, Mrs. Pemberton reported her concerns to Sergeant Robert Henley, the village constable. The next morning, Constable Henley entered the Higgins cottage with a spare key provided by Mrs. Thornton, who seemed to have one for every house in Ashworth. What he found inside was strange, but not alarming at first. Calm but foreboding. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, 4 bowls, 4 spoons. Tea was half brewed in the pot, a kettle still sat on the stove. Upstairs, beds had been slept in, but carefully made. Thomas's coat and work satchel hung by the door. Eleanor's gardening clogs rested neatly by the back step. Margaret's schoolbooks were laid out on her desk, and Billy's sketchbook lay open on the floor, showing one final unfinished drawing. A circle of figures, hands raised towards something glowing beneath the church. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no forced entry. It was as if the entire family had simply stood up and vanished. But what caught Constable Henley's attention most wasn't what was there, it was what was missing. Every single photograph of the family had been removed from the walls and shelves. Every framed picture, every school portrait, gone. Only empty nail holes and dust outlines remained. Even more disturbing, the small leather journal Eleanor had always carried was missing too. Building mystery. The official search began quietly. Henley didn't want to cause a panic. He checked with local hospitals, police stations, nearby towns. Nothing. No sightings. No calls. No clues. Over the next week, volunteers scoured the countryside. Dales, rivers, caves. Not a single trace. It was as if the Higgins family had been erased from the face of the earth. On November 10th, Henley requested permission to search St. Mary's Church. Reverend Whitmore agreed, but insisted the search would turn up nothing. They were a troubled family, he said. Perhaps they simply left. But Sergeant Henley wasn't so sure. He brought a small team to inspect the church, starting with the bell tower, the vestry, the crypt. Everything appeared normal, until one of the officers noticed something strange behind an old tapestry in the lower chapel. A small wooden door, sealed with a rusted chain. It wasn't on any of the blueprints. When they broke the lock, a narrow stone stairwell was revealed, spiralling down into darkness. The air that came up was damp, cold, and smelled faintly of ash and old soil. They descended with flashlights. The passage led to a hidden chamber about 20 feet underground. The walls were made of black stone, lined with carvings so old they'd been worn nearly smooth. Strange symbols, circles, markings, none of them Christian. In the centre of the room was a stone altar, stained dark. Around it, burnt wax from dozens, maybe hundreds of white candles. Ashes, charred herbs, animal bones, and something else, personal belongings. A child's red mitten, a woman's hairbrush, a silver cross engraved with the name Margaret Rose Higgins. And beside the altar, tucked inside a leather satchel, was Eleanor's missing journal. It was damp, covered in soot, but intact, and what it contained changed everything.
Quiet, suspenseful.
The journal began innocently enough. Notes on village folklore, quotes from old texts, herbal recipes. But by midsummer of 1965, the tone shifted. Eleanor began recording experiences she called awakenings. She wrote about forces beneath the church, wisp in the stone, dreams she shared with others in the group, especially Reverend Whitmore. She claimed the underground chamber was once a threshold, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. She wrote, "The rituals are not play acting. They are memory. We are remembering what must never be forgotten." By September, her entries became darker. The veil is thinning. Margaret sees them in her dreams. Billy hears them in the walls. Thomas resists, but even he feels the pull. The final entries, written just days before the family vanished, speak of an upcoming convergence. The night of completion approaches. October the 31st, the door will open again and the guardians will return. We must be ready. And then, one final sentence, dated November 14th, 1965, 2 weeks after the family had vanished. "We were never meant to leave. This is where we began. This is where we return." That entry raised one impossible question. Who wrote it? And how could it have been written 2 weeks after the family disappeared. Church authorities stepped in quickly after the discovery. The chamber was sealed, the journal locked away. Reverend Whitmore resigned from his post and vanished. No forwarding address, no explanation. Mrs. Margaret Thornton died quietly the following spring. Dr. Carr refused to speak to investigators, and the rest of the Historical Preservation Society simply dissolved. The case was marked unsolved. But something else was uncovered 20 years later in 1985 when sealed church archives were opened under a Freedom of Information request. Records of 4 other families, each one tied to Ashworth, each one missing, decades apart. 1743, 1812, 1897, and now 1965. And in every case, the last person seen with the family had been the village vicar. Slow and haunting. Today, the Higgins cottage still stands, abandoned. Locals say no one has lived there since. Children dare each other to approach it, but no one stays long. And every October 31st, the fog rolls down from the moors heavier than ever. It curls around the gravestones, the church tower, back the broken gates of the cottage. Some say if you stand in the churchyard after midnight, you can hear chanting deep below the ground. And sometimes, just sometimes, the church bell rings, even though it hasn't worked in over 40 years.
Outro. Whispered tone fading music.
In the next episode, we reveal the identity of the only surviving witness to the final ritual and why they stayed silent for 40 years. Until then, some family traditions should stay buried. Here's the final 15-minute segment of the Ashworth mystery story, written in a haunting cinematic style for a horror-themed YouTube voiceover. It brings resolution, revelation, and leaves one final chilling question. Language is simplified for clarity, paced for suspense, and tailored to engage an American audience. Low, reflect. For nearly 20 years, no one spoke about the Higgins family. The case was closed, officially marked as an unresolved disappearance. But in Ashworth, it was never forgotten. The cottage sat empty, the church doors locked earlier each evening. The villagers who had once smiled at every passerby now crossed the street when asked questions. Then, in 1985, everything changed. A journalist named Simon Hale, researching missing persons cases in rural England, filed a legal request to access restricted Church of England records. What he found buried in the archives stunned even seasoned investigators. Documents, sealed for decades, mentioned 5 disappearances. Not just the Higginses, but entire families, every few generations. Always in Ashworth, always connected to St. Mary's Church, and in 4 out of the 5 cases, the name of the vicar was listed. Except it was always a different man. Or was it?
10.
Building suspense. Hale began digging deeper into records going back to the 1700s. That's when the pattern became undeniable. Each time a family vanished, a new vicar had recently taken the pulpit. But old portraits from parish halls, many now faded, revealed something chilling. The vicars all looked nearly identical. Tall, thin, pale, the same sharp nose, the same narrow eyes, the same unnerving smile. Different names, different dates, but the same man? Simon Hale brought his findings to the local authorities. He was laughed out of the office, but one person did believe him. A woman who had refused to speak for 40 years.
Quiet, intimate.
Her name was Miss Sarah Collins, the former school teacher in Ashworth. She was in her 70s now, living in a care home in Leeds. She had never spoken publicly about the Higgins case until Hale found her. Their interview was recorded on cassette. And though the tape has never been officially released, a transcript made its way into the files we're using today. Here's what she said. I knew something terrible had happened to that family. I saw it happening long before they disappeared, but I was afraid. Eleanor wasn't practicing history. She was practicing devotion to something very old. She believed she was serving a power that lived beneath the church, and Reverend Whitmore, he encouraged it. He told her the Higginses were chosen, that they were descendants of a bloodline with a sacred duty. I think they believed it, all of them, even the children. But on Halloween night, I saw something through my window I never told anyone. I saw Eleanor in the graveyard. She wasn't walking. She was floating. Her feet didn't touch the ground, and behind her came the vicar, or something wearing his face. Soft and eerie, Miss Collins broke down during the rest of the interview, but she did say one more thing before Hale left. Whatever they opened that night, it didn't close. That line would haunt Simon Hale for years. He published a series of articles, a few gained attention. A documentary was briefly planned, then cancelled after a legal dispute with church officials. But the final chapter came in 1993. Simon Hale disappeared while hiking near Ashworth. He was last seen walking toward the old church ruins on October 31st. His body was never found. Calm but dark. Today, the church is abandoned, the doors chained, the tower crumbling. But strange reports continue to emerge. Campers in the Yorkshire Dales have claimed to see lights flickering around the old ruins. Some have heard music, low rhythmic chanting echoing across the hills at night. Others say they've seen figures standing silently in the fog. In 2012, a group of urban explorers broke into the underground chamber beneath Neath St Mary's and live-streamed their exploration on a now-deleted video. What they found was this: the altar still intact, new candles recently burned, and scratched into the stone floor, fresh words. They returned once. They will return again. No one knows who left that message. But what happened in Ashworth was not an isolated event. Final reveal low and dramatic. When the church was forced to declassify more documents in the early 2000s, one name kept reappearing. Order of the Veiled Light, a secret religious society hidden within the Church of England for centuries. Their mission? To protect the world from what lies beneath thin places, sites where reality wears thin, where old gods and buried rituals still echo in the bones of the earth. St Mary's was one of those places. The Higgins family, like Carrs, the Thorntons and others before them, weren't just victims. They were participants. They didn't vanish by force. They went willingly, following voices from the earth, returning to where it all began. Quiet, unsettling tone. So what really happened to the Higgins family? Did they perform a ritual that opened something ancient? Were they taken or transformed? We may never know the full truth, but this much is certain. The events in Ashworth weren't a myth. The people were real, the documents are real, and the mystery still unsolved. Even now, in the quiet parts of northern England, the old families speak carefully, and every October, just before Halloween, the fog returns heavier than ever, covering the graves, hiding the truth, waiting for someone to finish what began in that stone chamber. Outro, deep whisper with wind sounds. If you ever find yourself in the Yorkshire Dales and the fog rolls in after dark, do one thing: stay away from the church. Because some doors, once opened, never close. Low hum, soft bells, wind, and distant footsteps. This concludes the true account of the Higgins family disappearance and the rituals of Ashworth. If you've stayed with us to the end, you're one of the brave ones. Subscribe for more forbidden stories, comment where you're listening from, and tell us. Do you believe in places where the veil is thin?